right. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, good night, depending on where you may be joining us. Thank you for your punctuality. We're just going to give here a couple seconds while people join in from the waiting room and we'll get going. Thank you again. Perfect. Okay, I think we're good to go. So, Sean, go right ahead.
Great, thanks, Andres. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Verite, I'm extending a warm welcome to all of you joining us here today for a practical how-to training on supply chain mapping, risk assessment, and other key due diligence tools in the mining and transportation sectors that you can find on the responsible sourcing tool. My name is Sean McDonald, and I'm the CEO of Verite. Verite is a non-governmental, non-profit organization that promotes fair, safe, and legal work in global supply chains. And for my colleagues and myself, it's been a privilege to collaborate on these tools with the U.S. Department of State's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, as well as the U.S. Department of Transportation's Counter-Trafficking Initiative. Today is the final webinar in a three-part series. Earlier this month, we launched new toolkits for the mining sector and the transportation sector. And in this final webinar, we're going deeper into helping you apply these tools in your workplace. These tools build off Verite's practical expertise and longstanding work with the U.S. Department of State to develop sector-specific tools and new commodity reports on responsiblesourcingtool.org's website to enhance counter-trafficking efforts for companies and professionals working across many sectors, including seafood, food and beverage, security services, construction, and facility services. The shift to more regulation of supply chains worldwide via forced labor import bans, procurement rules, transparency requirements, and mandatory due diligence makes these resources all the more valuable and timely for companies and government officials alike. Today, we're going to take a deeper dive into how an organization can start understanding forced labor risk in their supply chain via supply chain mapping and risk assessment. Supply chain mapping allows a company to trace the chain of custody and its points of accountability to the farthest upstream level of its materials and services supply chains. Now I'd like to introduce you to Verite's Senior Director, Michael Vaudrell, who will walk through the key tools on the site that will help you carry out a risk assessment. Later, he'll be joined by our colleague, Lydia Long, who will manage our question and answer session. So thanks, and over to you, Michael.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. As Sean said, we will be covering risk mapping, supply chain mapping and risk assessment today. I'll spend about a minute talking about who Verite is, then talking through the process, and finally a Q&A, although we may do the Q&A a little differently this time because this is more of a training than a typical webinar. For each section of the process that I'm going to discuss, if you have questions that come up, if you didn't understand something, you want something clarified, type them in to the Q&A, and we'll try and address those as we go along. Thanks. So Sean mentioned very briefly, Verite's been around about 30 years. We're an independent nonprofit specializing in labor and human rights. We do a lot of human rights due diligence consulting for governments, companies, and other brand initiatives. And the work that we're presenting today is really the culmination of a lot of our work with the Department of State, Department of Transportation, and our corporate clients. So if you've attended either of the first two webinars, you'll recognize this flow chart. This is part of Tool 1 of the tool set, and it's a sample supply chain due diligence program. It covers all the steps of supply chain due diligence, from how a company can go about establishing a human rights or forced labor policy, contract terms, all the way through to how you manage the performance of a supplier on an ongoing basis. Now, this webinar is going to focus on a process that a lot of companies, a lot of organizations may find difficult, and that's because it typically is. And how do you determine from where and from whom you buy things, whether they're products, services, raw materials, whatever it might be, all the way up to the farthest reaches or furthest upstream level of your supply chain. And then once you know where things are coming from and who they're coming from, what's the relative risk associated with each? And knowing all of that, how do you then prioritize the suppliers and the supply chains in your chain for additional work, whether it's a deep dive assessment or actually to begin preventing and mitigating harm or remediating harm that you may have found during your assessment process. So we'll go through the overview right now, and that is, to begin with, this is a process. It's not a formula. It's not the Rosetta Stone for how you do risk assessment, because there are many different ways to do it. The important thing is to know that the type of information that you need to gather for a risk assessment is pretty much the same no matter what approach you take. But companies can take different approaches depending on the nature of their supply chain and the risks within it and the specific organizational issues that they're dealing with. So it all begins with supply chain mapping. And again, that is what are you buying? Where is it coming from? All the way up to the source of raw materials and services. Once you know where things are coming from, you need to identify what the risks are associated with the geographic location of those different entities in the supply chain, uh, with the sector that they're part of. If they're in the mining sector, the risks are very different than in the apparel sector or whatever business sector your supplier may be in. And then beyond that are issues that deal with the specific supplier, not with the supplier sector or the country, but what is it about the supplier in terms of the nature of their workforce, whether they use recruitment agents. Those types of things that are specific to the supplier will also feed into your assessment. And once you have all of that information, the next step is prioritizing it. You can't boil the ocean, so where do you start? And we'll get into that. And the prioritization helps you decide where you're going to do in-depth assessments where you need more information about a particular supply chain or supplier, and then actually to begin addressing risks and harms in the supply chain. Tools that'll help you do that. We covered these briefly in the first couple of webinars. One is Tool 4 that talks about country level legal protections. A lot of that information feeds into the country risk, obviously. Tool 6 is the overall process for performing a mapping and risk assessment exercise. It is not, again, a formula. It is a process to follow, and it outlines the types of information that you can gather or should gather and ways to put it together. Tool 7 is how do you go about screening labor agents if you're using labor agents for either recruiting foreign workers or for supplying contingent workers, temporary workers at the work site. And then finally, a more detailed set of questions for screening suppliers of any type, whether they be manufacturing or suppliers of metals and mining products. This is just quickly what Tool 6 looks like. It describes, again, the general process for mapping the supply chain and describes how it fits into the overall process of due diligence. It has two major components, the mapping and then taking mapping information and country and sector information to do a risk assessment, and finally provides a tool, kind of a fill in the blank form that you can use to gather all the information for all of your suppliers to do your assessment and prioritization. And so this includes where they are, what their workforce is like, the types of operations at their facility, everything that you would need to characterize the potential risks. When you start an assessment process, it's really good to keep in mind that risk assessment, risk mapping is really a way of narrowing down the number of issues, the number of suppliers that you need to work on right away. It's a funneling process, and it allows you to prioritize and focus on the highest priority issues of and suppliers. You know, companies may have only a handful of suppliers, or if you're a large multinational organization, you could have tens of thousands of suppliers. And no organization, whether it's a small services provider or a large manufacturer, has the resources to address all the risks at the same time. So prioritization is necessary, and that's what this process that we'll walk through really enables you to do, is how to put all that together to come up with your highest priorities. So beginning with supply chain mapping, what is mapping? This cartoon is a kind of an illustration of a typical supply chain, starting with mining all the way to the end user. And you can see that there are many different levels, and your supply chain may have more or less than that. And mapping is trying to find out where everything comes from, all the workplaces in the supply chain. We'll talk about traceability in a minute, but really it's, what do you buy, where does it come from, and who is providing it. So the issue as you begin this is that you may have a very good idea of who your direct suppliers are, your first tier. But the farther upstream you go, the closer you get in this illustration to that mining operation, the transparency, the visibility to what's up there and who's up there is in many cases a black hole. And we'll talk about approaches to dealing with that. But it is the first step. Without knowing what your supply chain map looks like, it's not going to be possible to do a comprehensive risk assessment. So there are a number of reasons why a company is going to want to do uh, a supply chain mapping. And obviously it's to understand your supply chain. We just beat that one to death. Um, It helps you target where you need to perform more detailed risk assessments, where you need to make interventions. It enables you to prioritize. Transparency is another reason for doing mapping. Openly sharing supply chain information with stakeholders is something that, well, many stakeholders require or request of their of companies. It's also something that companies do in a very public way. Um, you can look at the sustainability reports from many major companies, and thinking about this sector, you know, Ford Motor publishes a list um, of companies that provide gold and um, other conflict minerals. Um, Airbus, I know, has a supplier list on their website, and I know there are many others. I don't mean to leave anybody out, but being transparent about who's in your supply chain is a great way to be transparent and show that you are really trying to manage the risks in the supply chain. And then finally, it also helps organizations demonstrate accountability, to prove to government agencies, to prove that the customers that they are trying to comply with regulations and are managing risks in the supply chain. So how do you do it? Well, this is the heart of the discussion here, and it starts with mapping your tier one suppliers. Now, typically, your procurement organization should be able to provide a list of all your direct suppliers, may even have some upstream suppliers, particularly those that the organization directly manages or directly contracts with. And you may know these as suppliers that are on an approved vendor list. Um, They'll also have the names of any distributors, traders, and agents that they use, labor agents that your organization uses to recruit workers or to provide temporary workers, and then services providers, which is a part of the supply chain that a lot of organizations don't think too much about. But who is providing your site security? Who's cleaning the offices in the factory when everyone goes home? Those services providers are particularly important because they typically hire lower skill, lower paid workers that may be at greater risk of forced labor. So that's tier one, relatively straightforward. Um, once you know who they are, you can contact them directly, get all of the profile information shown here so that you then have those bits that you need in order to assign a risk level to their potential for forced labor. For example, are they using migrant workers, or have they outsourced the recruitment function? And get that as complete as possible. Then it's mapping the upstream suppliers. And this starts by working with your tier one. And it sounds fairly simple, but most times it is not. And it could be for a variety of reasons. Procurement records may not be complete. The organization may buy raw materials or components from agents or distributors who themselves may not know where a product is from, particularly as a raw material or a metal or something that's been where the ingredients have been put together in batches from many, many different raw material suppliers. Also, agents may be reluctant to provide the names or the sources of the products and services that they're selling to you, because for them it's a competitive advantage to have this great stable of suppliers, and they may not want to give up that information readily. So there are a lot of different reasons why this may be the case. Whoops, it went a little too far. I was working on a project a short time ago with a solar company, and they wanted to know where their polysilicon came from. And they were able to get their first tier. They even got to most of their second tier. But once we got to the third tier in their supply chain, nobody could tell us where those raw materials were coming from. The companies that were processing the raw materials, they knew who they were buying it from, but they did not know the source of the mine, the source of the quarry for those materials, because it had come from many different places, and their supplier was simply batching it together. And despite their best efforts, and of that supplier that was doing the initial processing, they could not say that this lot of polysilicon that we're shipping to you is from X, Y, or Z supplier. There was simply no way to do it. So that is one of the difficulties that you run into, especially when you're sourcing mining materials. Now, that gets us into this discussion of mapping versus traceability, because they're really two different things. Mapping is knowing who all of your suppliers are, and traceability is knowing every exchange, every transaction in the supply chain for every distinct batch of product or materials that you end up buying. So you may be able to map all your suppliers, but you don't know the interrelationships among all of them, and you don't know exactly how materials are moved from one tier to another or back and forth across tiers. So, and this is information that is necessary um, to get the origin of a product, especially for compliance with things like the Build America, Buy America Act. If you have to be able to say that this component is at least 70% domestic content, then you better know that exactly where all the components, all the sources of metal, all of the other things that are in that product came from, so that you can prove that you're in compliance with the law. And traceability enables you to do that. Traceability is establishing that chain of custody for every shipment from the mine to your final operation. It knows, it tracks the relationships among suppliers, and to do that you need transaction level data, and that means contracts, purchase order, bills of lading, customs declarations, RFI tagging, all kinds of chain of custody documentation that may not be readily available when you're doing simple supply chain mapping. You may have heard of blockchain. Blockchain is it's a decentralized IT technology for securely recording every transaction in a supply chain, each transaction or block. And it uses computers that are distributed across the globe and in the cloud that comprise the chain. That is something that's coming on as a technology. It's not appropriate for every type of material for every product at this time, but it is growing. And to learn more about not only blockchain, about other supply chain traceability methods, Verite has a website called Streams, which is a result of a multi-year effort that we had with the Department of Labor. And in it, there's some resources that describe aligning traceability and due diligence and everything else about traceability that can enable you to improve your supply chain due diligence process. Do we have any questions on mapping at this point, Lydia?
We do. I can read them to you. They're also in the Q&A queue. One is, does one have to repeat the mapping process, and if so, how often?
The answer is yeah, typically yes. I mean, supply chains are not constant, right? Suppliers come and go. Especially the larger organizations, there's constant churn in the supply chain. Even if your suppliers don't change, where they're sourcing from or where their operations are located changes as well. So regularly updating that supply chain map is essential to make sure that your prioritization of the risks in your supply chain is also up to date. No other? Okay. The Q&A is not visible the way my screen is laid out. So
I'll call them out as they come in.
okay, thanks. All right, so the second and third part of this process is identifying risks associated with the country or geography and in the industry. The last couple of webinars, we talked about the understand risk part of the responsible sourcing tool, and we showed you how you could to understand and the identify risk, how you could find country and sector risk indicators on that site. So I won't go through that again, but I encourage you, if you weren't in those and you're not familiar with the responsiblesourcingtool.org site, to go there and check those out. And there are other sources of geography and sector risk out there. Some that you have to pay for, most that you have to pay for, but they're good sources of information. Verisk Maplecroft, LRQA, and EcoVadis are three examples. They're different in a number of respects. EcoVadis draws their ratings from all of the assessments that they've done. These are web-based assessments where the supplier provides documentation. So they use all of that. They've pooled all of that data to generate risk information for sectors and countries. LRQA uses their database of audit data, so actual on-the-ground audit results that have been sorted to, again, produce risk level, indicator level data for sectors and for countries. And Verisk Maplecroft uses a lot of the same indices that are covered in the responsible sourcing tool.org, but they have their own process for combining all of those, an algorithm for taking them all, as well as some others, and creating an overall rating for a country or for a region within that country. Again, just quickly on the responsible sourcing tool, you can get to the geography risk and the three types of sector risk: product, operations, and workforce characteristics. So what the country information specifically that is available in the responsible sourcing tool, this is just a screenshot of the indices for China. There's a total of 17 of them, I think, on there. The 11 to the right, and I apologize if it's a little small, each of them has a risk level that you can use to either create your own index, to use them individually, to combine them however you choose to use them. But what I wanted to point out is each of them has this little question mark and at the end of it. And if you click that question mark, and we'll use the ILO one as an example, it describes how that index was created, what it means, and so that you can decide whether this is appropriate for the assessment that you're performing. And you can take the information off that page and put it directly into your tool. You can see that this one on ILO is really, it's a measure of how many of the 10 ILO conventions, the core conventions, has the country ratified. And if they've ratified a convention, that means they had to have put in place a legal framework to implement that convention. So a country that is ratified all 10 has a lower risk rating than a country that is only ratified one or two or none of those conventions. And then similarly, these are the other ones that are on that list, and each of them, if you go to that site, describes exactly what it is and what the risk level means. Okay, just very quickly, visual representation of some of those the data sources. The rule of law rating is from the World Justice Project. The Freedom in the World rating is by Freedom House, and then the Global Rights Index is by ITUC. So that one is heavily focused on labor rights and on the ability to for workers to exercise their rights of collective bargaining and freedom of association.
Michael,
Go ahead.
You may be about to speak to this already, but there's a question around. There's so many indicators to choose from. Can we use just one, or what's a good number, or how do we combine the ones we've chosen into an overall risk level, which the latter part of this question looks like you may be starting to talk about, but I think the question is getting at, is there a rule of thumb of how many you need? Because it
No,
is kind of a jungle out there.
no, and I can't. I I don't know how many of these I've helped organizations do, and every company approaches it a little bit differently. A lot of companies, for simplicity's sake, simply like to take one of those indices that I described, one that has already combined a lot of different risk factors, whether it's the EcoVadis or the LRQA or Verisk Maplecroft, and go with that. Others have picked 3 or 4 of the ones that I described, and they've come up their own way of combining it. They've maybe given each of them, 1/4 weighting and just simply added them together, or come up with a more complicated algorithm. Um, it doesn't really matter as long as you do 2 things. One is, after you've come up with something, is test it on a couple of suppliers or supply chains where you know what the risk is, and see if it gives you the expected result. And then once you have a formula or a combination of indices that you think works for you, is it apply it consistently across your entire supply chain. Don't change the way you look at risk, depending on the country or depending on the sector. Be consistent. Okay, and now we go into exactly the same thing. And because of that, I won't spend a lot of time. So it's use all of them, use a subset of them, whatever makes sense for you. Put that data into Tool 6 or some other data gathering form that you have. You may even want to create a visual representation of risk. And we've had a couple of clients that like this approach, because it's kind of an at a glance rather than going through a giant spreadsheet of numbers. If you assign a color coding to risk level and put the different, in this case, country risk on a spreadsheet with the indices in the columns, you can see which countries are going to pop out to you as being mostly red or orange, and that is just a simple way. And for people that aren't immersed in the topic, for non-subject matter experts, this is a very effective way of communicating risk level. And then there's a sector risk, and we again briefly spoke about that in the last couple of meetings. But what do we mean by that? And they really are the characteristics of an industry sector, of an entire sector, not of a specific supplier. So in the case of mining, for example, there's hazardous and undesirable work. That by itself is not a forced labor indicator, but forced labor is more prevalent in sectors that have hazardous or undesirable work, because the workers that typically do that work are more vulnerable to deception and other forced labor indicators. Then there's the fact of the weather vulnerable and easily replaced, low skilled workers are used. If there are migrant workers, now migrant workers are particularly vulnerable because of their status, because they may not have a full set of legal rights in the country where they're doing the work. I mentioned briefly the presence of labor contractors. Once an organization contracts out control of recruitment, selection, and hiring, you lose visibility to how that's done. And the majority of risks of forced labor are in that recruitment pathway, from when a worker first hears about the job opportunity to when they actually show up at your facility. And if you're not controlling that, if you're not making sure that responsible recruitment is practiced, that can be a real weak spot in the company's management process. And then the longer and more complex the supply chain, or non-transparent, the more the risk. Again, you don't have visibility to what's going on upstream. And if you're talking about a supply chain that begins at a mine and ends up in the finished product, whether it be a merchant marine vessel or an airplane, that is a very long supply chain. It could be 6 or 7 tiers that mushrooms out from tier one, and those risks, until you've done the detailed mapping and this detailed assessment, can be very invisible. More detail on each of these categories can be found in the sector report. In this case, it's pointing to the transportation sector report, but the mining sector report also has all of the information about the typical risks with specific examples in those sector reports. And we went through some of that in the 2 previous webinars. And if you didn't attend those recordings are available, and you can listen to those and hear some of the case information contained in those reports. Okay, so
Michael, just going to jump in real quick. There's a question around, other than the RST, where is there more available information on sector risks?
So we're not saying that the responsible sourcing tool website gives you everything you need to do an assessment of sector risk. We would encourage organizations to, for example, look for reports by NGOs, reports by government agencies, media reports of what's going on in different countries within different sectors. And that can supplement the information that's on the RST site. Also, a lot of companies already have audit information and other types of assessment information available that can be sorted by the type of supplier that was audited to find the typical risks. So there are many different sources that can be used. Anything else, or is that okay?
You keep going. There's some other questions coming in, but
All right, we'll get
lot
to
them
those.
in
Okay.
based on
All right.
where you are in the module.
Okay. So we've looked at country and sector risks. Now it's what do we need to learn about a supplier to layer on top of these other risks to give you even more information to prioritize your due diligence process. So some of the common things that you look for across any type of supplier is how much visibility is there into the tiers above them. Does your direct supplier, for example, know where everything that they're putting in your product or providing in the services that they're giving to you, do they know where that's coming from? Spend is another one. How much you're spending with a supplier, all other things being equal, the one you're spending the most on probably is a good one to start with, assuming that you don't have a smaller supplier that has a much higher risk of harm to people, because harm to people is the first thing that you want to look at. Is it a strategic supplier, or someone that you simply buy something from, but you could buy the same thing someplace else? Obviously, a strategic supplier that you have a long-term relationship with is another factor that you'd want to consider, as is your ability to influence their behavior. Direct suppliers typically have more influence over, unless that supplier actually happens to be bigger than your organization itself, and we see that quite a bit. So the ability to influence, whether it's alone or collectively, is one that needs to be looked at. For traders and agents, we talked a little bit about it, is how transparent are they in where their materials, where their products are coming from, and can those products be traced back to their their source? And are they simply buying stuff, or do they have a due diligence system in place where they're only buying products or materials from suppliers that they have performed effective due diligence on? For processors and smelters, traceability is also an issue. Um, you may know that there's an organization called the Responsible Minerals Initiative, RMI, which is under the auspices of RBA, the Responsible Business Alliance. They run a smelter certification process. They have a conflict minerals due diligence process. A lot of things that can help any organization that buys metals or minerals to get a handle on where the materials come from, to ensure that there's traceability, so that they are not knowingly buying something that is supporting armed groups in a conflict area. Then for manufacturers, the main things are, what are their recruitment and hiring practices? And I mentioned services providers, a big source of risk for many companies are those folks that are coming in to do all of the things that their own employees aren't doing. They don't necessarily pay as much attention to them as they do to what they're doing themselves. And so that introduces a lot of potential risk of forced labor. In logistics, warehousing, and transport, a lot of contract labor, and this contract labor can be foreign migrant workers. It can simply be temporary workers, but again, because that labor is managed by a third party, there is a risk to that logistics company. Once you have all that information, you've got the information on what your high-risk sectors are, the geographies, you've got some basic information about suppliers, is how do you prioritize? And how do you go to either a deep dive assessment where you know you need to get more risk information about a supplier or a supply chain, or you go directly to harm prevention or harm remediation? And that's where the concept of salience comes in. Now, it's more important if we were talking about how you're doing a risk assessment across a broad spectrum of human rights issues. You know, which ones is forced labor, child labor, wages and hours, gender issues, all of those things. They aren't all of equal importance in every sector and in every country. So you would have to do a salience analysis, and that is identify those human rights issues that are at risk of producing the most serious negative impact as a result of your organization's business activities or your business relationships. So the first thing to consider for salience is impact on people. For years, we talked about materiality, which was looking at social and environmental issues in terms of what was the greatest impact on the organization. Human rights salience focuses on which ones produce the most harm or can produce the most harm to people. And the focus is on how to avoid that harm. So how do you prevent the harm from occurring, or how do you minimize the amount of harm if it does occur? The issues that you're looking at in particular is the severity of the harm, and severity being how serious is the harm and how widespread is it, and how difficult is it to remediate, or irremediability. I don't even know how to say it properly, but is the harm that could occur easy or difficult to remediate? Those that are most difficult to remediate would be a higher priority to address in your further due diligence activities. And then you have to look at likelihood. It could be an incredibly horrible harm that could occur. But if the likelihood were next to zero, it would not be of the highest priority. And then other factors to consider, we talked a little bit about it already, is your ability to directly mitigate the harm, meaning you can directly control the type of preventive actions or remediation that's performed, your ability to influence or leverage, and then are there ways to collaborate with other customers, with other companies, with a trade association to reduce that risk. So looking at all of these things is a way to determine um, whether forced labor or one of the other human rights issues in your supply chain is the most salient one to address. Could spend an hour just on salience, but we will move on here.
Michael, can I I'm gonna give you the question. You can decide whether to go to the next slide first, but it is, how do you go about prioritization if you lack visibility into your supply chain? For example, you could not complete the supply chain mapping exercise due to lack of information.
And this is something that companies run into all the time. There is, you can, where you lack information going upstream, many times you're able to do some research to kind of fill the gaps. If you don't know where a supplier or second tier supplier is procuring something, if you know what country they're in and you know what it is that they're procuring, there are other sources of information that can tell you, well, it's likely coming from somewhere else in the country, or, that particular material is not available in that country, so it's probably imported. There's a database called Comtrade, operated by the UN, that has a lot of this information. So that's one thing you can do. And although there are no conversations that can be had with competitors around pricing and sourcing, you can, by talking with peers at other companies, get some idea of what supply chains may look like in a particular sector, in a particular country. So is that going to fill the information gap completely? No. But that's something that can be done. And then on a kind of a go forward basis, what a lot of companies are doing is in their contracts with their tier one suppliers, they are putting in the requirement that in order to be a supplier to us, you have to provide supply chain mapping information for where you're buying all of your materials that end up in our products. So making a contract requirement over time, that can have the effect of improving the information that you're able to gather. But in the absence of it, a little bit of research and then focusing your due diligence efforts on the tier one where you do have more information. Okay. Don't want to get into the details of this, but is another example of prioritization. This is a calculation that we used with another client a few years ago, and it took a lot of the things that we're talking about, country risk, sector risk, strategic value, and the amount of spend, and combined all of those to come up with what is the priority for a particular supplier. So if you look at, and I don't want to go through all the calculations and weightings, but if you look at these two, they're looking at a supplier who's in the electronic sector and another one who's in mining sector, what country they're in, how much is being spent or purchased from them, whether they are of strategic value to the company. And then you have these risk values and weightings. And so those get multiplied together to come up with the rating. Is this the the be all and end all of calculating risk? Certainly not. But it's something that can produce a result that is consistent across different geographies and different sectors. And like I was saying earlier, when you assign a risk rating to a country and a weighting to that risk, and you run your calculations, if you have one that is a high risk and it doesn't calculate to be a high risk, then you have to play with your algorithm. But this is just something that we were able to use with a client. Okay. So the next level of assessment, once you have come up with your priorities, you've got your highest risk sectors and countries and highest risk suppliers within those sectors and countries, based on the information that you've gathered and put into that data collection tool in tool 6. You can then figure out or then use other tools in the tool set to go the next step. And so tools 7 and 8 enable you to do that. So tool 7 is screening criteria for agents. And you can use this with new recruitment agents, and as well as ones that you already have as on board as a supplier to you, and get into depth on if they comply with the law, if they practice responsible recruitment, anything that you have in your requirements or that you want to check in the legal requirements, you can use this and get into greater depth about whether that particular labor supplier is a risk for your organization or not. And then tool 8 is a questionnaire, self-assessment questionnaire that applies to any kind of supplier, and has 3 parts. It asks about how that supplier, how that company recruits, selects, and hires workers. So if they're not using a recruitment agent, if they're doing it themselves, it gets into their own practices. Then it asks how they manage recruitment agents. So tool 7 is for the agency itself. Does the agency practice ethical recruitment? And this one is looking at the supplier and the requirements the supplier has for that agency and whether they are making sure that the agency practices responsible recruitment. And then finally, how are migrant workers who happen to be working at that workplace managed? There are questions for each of those 3 categories, and then there's guidance for what if the supplier says this? If they answer this way, well, this is an at-risk practice because of these reasons. And so that is something that can really help a company understand whether a supplier, either a current or a potential supplier, represents a heightened risk of forced labor. After doing that kind of remote deep dive assessment, you may choose to do a ground level or an in-depth assessment or audit. You may have a prospective supplier that really is questionable and you want to get a more detailed look at exactly what they're doing before you sign on with them. So the on-site assessments, either pre-contracting, pre-production, are a good idea. You can use data from other customers about that supplier. There are initiatives out there where companies can share audit information about a supplier, so you have information available to you. Verite operates a system called Cumulus that has that kind of risk information about recruitment agents that are available to companies that sign up to use the system. So there are ways to get more in-depth information about suppliers or agents. Can also get worker feedback, and it would encourage companies to obtain as much worker feedback and input as possible about what's going on at a workplace, because those are the folks affected by workplace practices. And you really can't determine whether a practice is respectful of worker rights or whether a corrective action has taken care of an issue that a worker had unless you actually talk to the workers. And so you've got 3 tools that can get into these areas. The first one, tool 9, is the follow-on to tool 7. So tool 7 was what is a supplier's, a labor agent's practices look like, remote assessment. And this one is actually, how do you audit, or how do you assess a labor agent who is working for you? And it's got many different sections that get into everything from how do they advertise for the job to they actually have a grievance process available for job candidates from the point of recruitment. Um, Tool 11, worker engagement, I mentioned that is one that gets into how do you proactively gather worker information as a form of monitoring. It's not simply waiting for a worker to file a grievance, but it is surveying, interviewing, having workplace meetings so that workers are pulled into the process of actually creating workplace practices and monitoring how well they're working. Then tool 11 is, tool 10 is really practical guidance on how to interview migrant workers. Migrant workers are particularly vulnerable because of their contingent status. They're frequently insecure economically. They're afraid of denunciation to authorities. They may not speak the local language. And as I mentioned before, they may not have the legal protection that local workers hold. So it's an essential process to talk to these workers to verify that corrective actions, are adequate, that remedial actions meet their requirements. And it's a very careful process. It's not a simple matter of using a translator to ask questions, but whoever is interviewing migrant workers needs to be specially trained to how you do that. How do you gain the workers' trust? How do you get meaningful information from the workers? Assure them that any information you gather is confidential and the like. So this tool gets into quite a bit of detail on how you do that in a respectful, confidential way. It provides sample questions, many more than are listed on this slide, that cover all of the ILO indicators of forced labor, and also tells you what are the common red flags based on what a worker may say. And that is the end of our time. Lydia?
There's some fantastic questions in here that would keep us all a lot longer than less than a minute we have left. The only one that can be squeezed in is you answered almost all of it. And is it considered best practice to have on-site assessments conducted by independent third parties? And I think that goes to the question around the interviewing as well.
No, absolutely. The most effective ones are done by independent entities. And again, I'll stress the fact that the worker interviews, which are an essential part of any on-site assessment, need to be done by native language speaking, trained interviewers who know how to gain the trust of workers in a very respectful way. And those interviews need to be conducted as best as possible out of sight and hearing of management, especially migrant workers who are at risk of any kind of retaliation for speaking to auditors, and which may include doing those interviews off-site or in some neutral location. Okay.
There's just this question here around how do you incentivize suppliers to participate? And I think that is just too big a question. It is so spot on, whoever put that question on the board. And I don't, and Michael, if you have a single sentence reply to that, you could go for it. But otherwise, I think that we probably need to hang on for a bit because we are past time.
How do you invite suppliers to
No,
participate?
incentivize.
Incentivize. Well, supplier incentives are a key part of building human rights into your business management system. So a supplier who is doing well, who's meeting your requirements, who's complying with the law, they should get some kind of reward for that. There should be some kind of incentive, whether it's something as simple as getting more favorable payment terms, getting a more stable order amount and frequency over the course of a year, whether they get a bonus for that, some kind of a supplemental payment for meeting your requirements. But there are definitely ways to incentivize suppliers from a business perspective. Yeah.
Yes, I'm going to gavel us closed. Thank you for everybody for your participation, everybody. Thank you, Michael, for incredibly clear and helpful presentation. And I think we'll have to wrap it up now. So you can, I think it maybe one more slide to go, which gives you a way to get in touch with us. We would love to hear your feedback, follow-up questions, any other ways in which we can continue to enrich your understanding of this. So thanks again, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks for participating.